Hello, good evening to you. We're going to dive into James chapter 1 or James chapter 2 in just a moment. Still no sign of the books. I guess it was 2 weeks ago, Thursday, that I ordered them. And then 2 weeks ago, this coming Sunday, that I got confirmation they were shipped. And that's the last I heard. It's just that time of year, and whatever reason, the pandemic still seems to have influenced shipping. We ordered a 7.5-foot tall Christmas tree from Home Depot that made it to Bessemer, and then they scanned it from Tuesday through Saturday in Bessemer, and they've lost it since then. So who knows? How do you lose a 7.5-foot Christmas tree? I don't know. But that's what it is for now. So we'll do our best with what we've got, and hopefully we'll have those books in soon, and we can distribute those to you. So there was a story from previous generation of Americans, early American, I guess, the industrial era and the financial booms of that time, where a bank in Chicago was looking to hire a young man who had grown up in Boston. And so they wrote a letter to a bank, an investment group in Boston, to ask, do you know much about this guy? Can you recommend him, for us? And so they wrote back glowing things about this young man. The emphasis on what they wrote was, well, his father was a Cabot. His mother was a Lowell. Further back was a blend of Saltonstalls and Peabodys, and they only listed the rest of Boston's first families. And they said, of course, based on all this, we recommend him without hesitation. Several days later, they received a return letter from the Chicago bank that said the information was still inadequate, and their explanation was, we're not contemplating using him for breeding purposes, just for working here. We're quick to make some judgments, aren't we? We're quick to make some determinations about what constitutes value and what does not. It's far too easy for each of us to judge each other too quickly and too strongly. When we then make decisions, actions based on those judgments, we're moving sinful thoughts into sinful actions. Jesus is the one that God would say he's given over all judgment to him. Jesus himself said, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. That's a fascinating context where the Jews were mad at him for healing on the Sabbath, but they would keep the law of Moses about circumcision on the Sabbath. So he says if it's right to perform that law, to keep the law, isn't it right to love people on the Sabbath? You're making judgments based on appearances. Instead, be consistent. Be consistent and right based on truth when judgment has to happen. So proper judgment is different from improper judgment. What he's going to get into in James 2 is this idea of partiality, how we misjudge and then mistreat based on those misjudgments. So quickly, by way of review, let's just take an assessment about ourselves in a way that I think can be helpful, a helpful way to catch us up to speed on what all we've talked about in chapter 1, but also just to keep reminding us, this is about me. This is about each of us individually first. As we read through this, we need to be asking, am I being partial? Have I shown partiality? Will I show partiality the next time? So let's just take an assessment by way of chapter 1. How am I presently, quote, enjoying, counting it joy, through steadfastness in the midst of suffering? How would I rate, how would I describe my present state of joy through steadfastness in the midst of suffering? How often am I boldly asking God for wisdom? How often do I blame God? How quick am I to blame others? How strongly do I respect the dangers of sin? How often do I remember and acknowledge God's constant generosity? How attentively do I listen to God? How attentively do I listen to others? How effective am I at controlling my speech and my anger? How consistently have I put away practicing repentance? How strongly do I love the Word of God? How effective am I at moving knowledge into action? How religious do I think I am? And how have I helped the most vulnerable in the church, the most vulnerable in the community? Now, these questions are all that he covers in chapter 1, but they also constitute, it covers almost all the bases, if not all the bases, of what's expected of the Christ follower, the disciple of Jesus Christ. You can look at these topics, you can look at these things that James addresses very much through the lens of a day in the life of a Christian. It's going to challenge every thought, it's going to challenge every word, challenge every step, challenge every decision. Somehow in these, 11 questions that we asked, I think we could focus our attention on James 1 almost in exclusivity, and it still really never exhausts application to our lives every day. Clearly that's true with the book of James 2. God gives us everything we need in the entire Bible, but there's just a concentration of core principles and core actions and attitudes that are found in James 1 that then impact everything else. And that's no different when we turn to James chapter 2. We're going to see several of these important thoughts and attitudes carried over into chapter 2. Now, the way he's got this divided is chapter number, 7? Chapter 7, which begins on page 67, covers James 2, 1 through 9. I kind of broke down the text 1 through 13. So we're going to read James 2, 1 through 13, and kind of notice some textual aspects of that quickly. But then when we dive into his thoughts, just remember he's going to stop at 9, and then his chapter 8 will pick up and cover 10 through 13. All right, so let's read together James 2, 1 through 4. My brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, you sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down at my feet, have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Someone want to read 5 through 7? Okay, go ahead and finish out and do verse 9.
If you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors.
I messed up the slides a little bit there. Now someone finish out and include 10 through 13 for us. All right, very good. Thank you. What does the text say? Quick observations from the text before we dive into what Brother Tommy says. There are two main commands, all right? If we pull this text out and we say, well, what is it that James wants us to do? What is it that we can look back and say, God says, do this? And the first is, do not show partiality as you hold the faith. And the second is found in verse 12, so speak and so act. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged under the law of liberty. So do this. Don't hold the faith in partiality, and be sure that when you speak and when you live, it's consistent with the law. It's consistent with your own actions, your own words, but also those are consistent with the law. Now, there are other imperatives in the text, obviously. He says, listen up. Hear this, verse 5. And then, of course, there's those imperatives when we tell the people in the assembly what to do, what not to do, those kind of things. And then you get into verses 8 and 11. You've got scripture that's quoted. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then do not murder, do not commit adultery. Those are imperatives too. And obviously, God would have us to keep those commands. But in terms of the driving commands in this text, it's don't show partiality and speak and act with consistency in alignment with the law. Okay? So those two things need to drive us constantly together. Now, I think that one in verse number 1 that leads us out here, I think it's good that we read from the ESV here in our class time, but Brother Edward read from the New King James. That is the more literal approach. That's really the more common approach. The ESV takes a different route, and I'm still curious as to why they did that, but there's a lot of discussion about it. But they take the imperative and make it don't show partiality. Most literally, it's actually have the faith or hold the faith with no partiality, in no partiality. It's modifying the command. So you be sure to live out the faith, and as you do, it cannot be accompanied by partiality. But still the same end result. It's just kind of fascinating because typically the ESV's translation philosophy is to be more literal than King James, New King James. But there, it takes a more dynamic approach. The second command, verse 12, it's a reminder, obviously, of verse 1, but it's kind of the completion of that expectation. That if you're going to have the faith without partiality, how's it going to look? Well, it's going to come by speaking and acting consistent with those who keep the law and who are going to be judged by the law. You're going to make your judgments and your actions in full awareness of the fact that you're going to be judged by the true just judge and his written law, his revealed law. And so I think together you take 2 verse 1 and 2 verse 12, and you see the same echo of what Jesus would say in Matthew 7, 1 and 2. Judge not that you be not judged, for with this judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. With the measure you use, it'll be measured to you. You get both of those in conjunction with one another. And so we would do well in James 2, just like we need to do in Matthew 7, to not separate both sides of that coin. It's easy to look out and tell people, well, don't hold your faith and partiality against me. But the reminder is to all of us, we need to all speak and act with consistency, knowing we're going to answer to the just judge and the one who gives us the law. It's easy to accuse other people of judging, but it's difficult to live consistently. We all need to be aware of the trap for partiality and correct ourselves and let that be our primary concern. All right, moving on through the text. The example that he uses is that of partiality in this rich and poor dynamic in the assembly. It's not limited to that setting. This would have been the major social construct of the first century. Maybe masters and slaves would have been right there close to it. Slave class versus the working class, everybody else. But rich, poor was just so strong. There was no real middle class as we think of it today. And so we would kind of all constitute the middle class, we think of it, no matter kind of the varying income level. Well, back then, they didn't really have that. It was strong, poor, rich. And so every assembly, there may be this possibility because there's a wide gap between poor and rich. Brother Tommy, as we'll notice, he thinks maybe it's even referencing a specific circumstance or repeated circumstances in this area. What we need to do is first to remember how this was directed toward them in their context with that notable rich-poor dynamic. And remember that could still be possible today, is clearly possible today, but also have the courage to be able to apply it in so many other directions too. That it could be racial, it could be more status as opposed to wealth. It could be family background. We get in a little more rural setting and and small town kind of feel, and everybody knows everybody, and family dynamics come into play, we can make judgments and hold people partial based on some of those things, right? And so we need to learn the principles most of all while keeping that direct dynamic in mind, because it still is important. Now, he ties this back to chapter 1, verse 27. I had the thought, how does this example of the rich man, poor man in the assembly, how does it tie back to 1 in verse 26? 1 in verse 26. If anyone thinks he is religious, does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart. How does partiality in the assembly based on the rich-poor dynamic, how does that connect to 1 in verse 26? Okay. 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 Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, can you hear the people who say to the rich person, I mean, you can hear how, like when they dismiss that day, for instance, look how religious we are. We had so-and-so here today with us, and we gave him the best seat in the house. And we're going to circle this day on the calendar as the day that this wealthy person visited us. And we're going to see if he wants to be a member. And we're going to run with all of this thinking that builds us up and puffs us up. But then James just sat here and just said, your speech is what betrays you. It's your lack of bridling your tongue that proves you're not really religious. You're just going through this for yourself. You're self-righteous, not truly righteous. Yeah, there's a deception, yeah. 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 Right. Yeah, and you could go to assembly somewhere else and see it happening and be like, whoa, that's bad. But we miss it when it's us, right? Oh, definitely, yeah. Yeah. Yep. 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 That's good. That's right. Yep. Yep. Well, Roger? Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, if we take that. Yeah. Right. Yep. Right. Right, yeah, and true hospitality is when it's costly, when it's difficult. And to take the easy person and say, well, this must mean I'm faithful and I'm welcoming and I'm hospitable. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Right, yeah. That's it. Yep. All right, great thoughts. Verses 5 through 7, the other level to this, he's going to explain further. There's the general partiality, mistreating different standards for different people. That's bad always. But then he says, this is why this specific reason is wrong and bad. It's that because for you in this situation, the persecution they're experiencing, it's by the rich. So here you are, getting nervous, and you're suffering for your faith. And yet when the class of people that are responsible for your persecution comes in, you mistreat them with good mistreatment, right? You view them differently than God views them. God wishes they would stop mistreating you. And yet you're the ones kowtowing to them, thinking that builds you up somehow. So there's that dynamic that goes on as well. The ones that you mistreat, though, the ones you look down on, the poor, are the ones that God views highly, and treats well. And then verses 8 and 9 really bring this home. This is not a small issue. This is not something we can just say, oh, well, that's my cross to bear. That's my struggle. That's just who I am. That's my family dynamic. That's just the way I've always been. If we're practicing this, if we're harboring in our heart and then we're allowing it to impact our choices, it's sin. Loving one another is hard, but not loving one another is sin. We're on either side. We're on one side of that dynamic. We can't just say, well, I can't love one another consistently, so that's just the way it is. No, it's when we intentionally keep rolling through that stop sign, that warning of God, then we are even sinning. All right, verses 10 and 11, they explain and illustrate the principle of verse 9. Here's why it is a sin. Here's why it is a big deal. Because there's no law in the law that's by accident. And so they would look at murder and adultery as big deals. Well, he wants them and wants us to view love your neighbor fully as yourself, fully love your neighbor as yourself, just the same way we view those extreme sins that we think about, sins of commission, the murder and the adultery. No one justifies either of those sins because they're not the other sin, okay? You get into his logic. You don't have adultery happen and say, well, at least it wasn't murder. Or you don't have murder happen and say, well, at least it wasn't adultery. No, the victims of those are tore up and upset, and rightfully so. And that should be the same way with every sin, that you don't justify one sin because it's not the other. So then he wraps up this with talking about mercy. Those who are prone to judge will not receive mercy. Those who operate with God's mercy, which is impartiality, will also receive God's mercy. And our way all this ties together is that our partiality or impartiality toward one another is the reflection of our partiality or impartiality toward God and his law. That's what John gets into. If you say you love God but you hate your brother, you don't really love God. Well, James's logic is if you say you love God and if you say you keep the law and you keep all the law, but you don't treat all the people with love, you don't really keep the law. And that's the toe-clenching kind of moment, right? That's where we have to curl those up because, ouch, that hurts. We like to say, I'm religious because look at what all I do, look at what all I don't do. But until I love my neighbor and I love all my neighbors with the love of God, I've got a lot to still keep working on. Questions, comments through verse 13. Just a big picture view of the text. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yes. Absolutely. That's very true. If we went to a big city and we're going to do a church plant, we'd try to find out as many churches and Christians that are established and wealthy or whatever else. And maybe there's some wisdom to some of that. But what Jesus do, he went and found hardworking fishermen and, kind of the edges of culture and society. They didn't live in Jerusalem. And then when he was going about, he spent time with people caught up in sin, and people who were poor, and people who were sick and cast off from society. Yeah. 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 Right. That's where it needs to start. Yep. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and we acknowledge the capacity for biases and even that they exist within us, but that God's the one that has the power to reveal them to us through his word and help us to keep correcting them. Like we start with that, that's earthly behavior, but I don't want to live there anymore, and so I'm going to keep purging them and correcting them and calling myself out on them through his word so that I can overcome them. One other thought I'd mentioned on the text is quick to judge might be a similar statement as quick to anger. Be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Judging and anger are more or less the same process. Anger happens when someone or something doesn't meet our expectations. So I try to control the circumstance even more with my loudness, with my rudeness or whatever it is. And so to judge is kind of an exercise of that same muscle. They don't meet my expectations. They didn't do what I thought they should, so I'm going to have to respond and answer in a certain way. And so I think that's another connection back to chapter 1 to help us just to see this is all exercise of the true faith and the true word that he's given us. Edward? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yep. Yeah, if we're a respecter of persons, we are fundamentally different from God. God's not a respecter of persons. God shows no partiality. So when we do, we're acting different from God himself. All right, anything else to add from the text? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right, yeah. Yeah, that's it. If it started with chapter 2, we wouldn't have had the tools and the framework to be able to address it. Yeah. All right, what else? Thank you so much for reading and for commenting. We'll dive into chapter 7 of Brother Tommy's book next week. So read up if you have not yet. A lot to chew on, a lot to unpack there. And I can see why he ended up dividing it up into 2 chapters, more or less, just because this chapter, verses 1 through 9, as he took it, he developed thoroughly and did well with it. So I hope you'll read that. And Lord willing, we'll have books in. Maybe we'll have them Sunday, and you can grab one of those if you need it. If you want me to make you a copy of the chapter, I'm confident Tommy will be okay with that. I don't know if his publisher would, but we'll help you out if you want an advanced copy before the copy comes in. Let me know. We'll get you that. All right. Thank you so much.